Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com. Oscast.
Welcome to Strategicon.
Hello world, I'm John Bruni and you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. Today we are again joined from the UK by Rhoderick Miller. After our last episode on the Russia-Ukraine war, we thought it'd be interesting to hear what Rod has to say about China and Taiwan through the lens of his hyper-realist perspective. Rod, welcome back to Strategicon.
Thank you for having me.
Rod, I'll start off by asking why China seems to have taken a relatively cautious sort of note in their support of Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Is it that they're fearful of secondary sanctions should they come out too stridently in Moscow's favor?
I'm not entirely sure they have in anything been moderate. The last time this happened, basically the Chinese said to all their companies, hold off for 2 weeks, let's figure out how we can get through the legal loopholes, and then you can all start up back over here. And that's basically what they did. And that seems to be basically what they've done this time. Like, everybody hold off 2 weeks, we'll let the lawyers play around, and we'll start back up. I don't see it as anything more dramatic than that.
You know, in conversation with many people over the last few weeks, you know, we've all been discussing China's role in you know, either supporting or not supporting Russia. And the interesting thing is that, you know, if we take the extreme view and we say that there is a Sino-Russian axis, if you will, right? Would China's economy be able to effectively take on the economy of another sovereign state of 144 million people in order to keep this axis viable and going? I mean, just to basically poke Joe Biden in the eye or, you know, give the Americans the proverbials. I mean, how deeply ensconced are the Chinese and the Russians in each other's business?
The general impression I get is they are moderately and they're heading towards being intensely. But I think of it from this perspective. The Russians need a reliable market and the Chinese need reliable resources. And both of them need no Americans in the way. It's existential for both of them. The Chinese do not want America to do to them what they did to the Japanese before the Second World War. They don't want to be strangled and forced to go fight wars in the middle of the ocean against the American Navy. They don't want that. They want to be able to get all their resources nice and safely and overland. And I think the thing we're missing is seeing how the Russian central bank was attacked. What happened? The Indians said, yeah, we're going to jump on board your boat now. So now we have this grand alliance, which we're never going to be able to, as a West, defeat, which is, you know, Russia, who brings with it India, Pakistan, and China. And who else is going to get joined in? Well, the Iranians, obviously, and various South American countries. As I see it, we have a dying alliance of Western nations against China because some idiots made some pretty poor policies in the last 4 or 5 weeks with regards to Ukraine. Basically, a process was going to take decades has taken weeks instead.
David?
Where to start? I suppose first thing, I agree with Rod that fundamentally, you know, Russia and China were interacting moderately, and as they've got further and further out on the fringe, it's become obvious that the old line, my enemy's enemy is my friend. They don't like each other. They will never like each other. But because it's existential threat, because you've got two leaders who believe in multi-century legacy, because you've got two leaders who are more than happy to have a population that they're going to reshape in their image, they have what each other need. I think this just all happened earlier and more extremely than China would have wanted. That's a massive problem. As Rod said, it's hastened the disintegration of sort of tepid globalization as we had it, where everyone thought it was a fixed and finished project, when in reality, the only thing that was keeping it going was America wanted it and Europe liked sucking money in. That's now over. We're at the beginning of a genuine split into two camps, where one camp don't even seem to know it's happening yet, i.e. the Western camp. They're delusionally bumbling along thinking this is about Ukraine, when in reality, we just essentially have the West not realizing this is not about Ukraine. This is fundamentally about who makes more cheap stuff than anyone else and who can provide affordable wheat, energy, and fertilizer. And I would say within probably less than a month, multiple countries are now saying they're out of food within 3 months, which means they have to pick a side within 3 months. I don't think the West will even be awake in 3 months that this is the new game. And by that point, China and Russia will have already negotiated the new deals with everyone who is going to be in the camp of reliable food supplies, reliable energy supplies, reliable fertilizer supplies, and reliable goods and service supplies. And Russia and China by the end of this year will have they'll have far more than half the world's population hooked on that deal, even if it's less than half of the landmass.
That's a big call, David. I mean,
it's a very practical call, and it's amazing. Yeah. It's amazing how bad the media has been and how mediocre the analysis is. We have tons of analysis of, could the Ukrainians keep 2/3 of their country? Who cares? It's really important for the Ukrainians, but globally, that is the secondary issue to the fact that Putin has maybe 6 weeks before he has to start turning off all the oil infrastructure that faces west if he can't export it. And if he has to turn it off, it will take years to turn back on, which means he needs to win people over to coming into ports and filling up with oil in the next 4 to 6 weeks, or he genuinely is in trouble in a new and different way.
Okay, so the idea that China is under such a degree of pressure, food-wise, water-wise, resource-wise, financially, we still have that whole Evergrande thing bubbling along in the background. We don't know exactly how that's going to play out.
But let's put in some details about Evergrande. Fundamentally, the CCP told multiple mid-level banks to absorb the hit. And the West went, how can they do it? It'll cripple the economy. How can they do it? It'll cripple the economy. Of course, it won't cripple the economy, because when it comes to internal debt, the Chinese are essentially running on MMT. They tell a bank to go and create new money to get rid of the debt temporarily, to put that debt on their books, and then they tell that bank to never pay that money back. And from a Western perspective, this means that all the moderate-sized banks in China are carrying bad debt and are clearly all going to go bankrupt. If we look at it, the Chinese have been running their financial sector this way since the early 1990s, and guess what? It still hasn't gone under, which means they don't care about bad debt. It's simply ones and zeros in their own currency for internal political purposes.
I want to return to something that Rhoderick mentioned earlier about the whole idea of, this group of powerful states coming together. You've got the Indians, the Pakistanis,
not powerful,
the Iranians.
Desperate.
Well, desperate and yet, let's say influential rather than
desperate
powerful.
and armed.
Right. So anyway, these countries are all coming together. They're developing a new strategic alignment of sorts. But the truth of the matter is that they're all also kind of not traditional friends of the other either. And I wonder just how sustainable such an alignment of these kind of powers will be. I mean, Pakistan and India are mortal enemies. India and China are sort of enemies. If you throw in the North Koreans, well, they hate everybody, including their patron, the Chinese. So it's like, where do they fit in this? And how does such an architecture evolve? Does it evolve organically? Does Moscow take the lead? Does Beijing take the lead? How does this structure actually work? Will it actually be a proper security architecture for those states involved? Or will it just be, a temporary alliance of convenience until the international community does different things to allow these countries back in their own respective ways?
Rod, do you want to go first? Do you want me to go first?
I'll let you take over most of it, but the obvious screaming question is, well, How did we do it with France and Spain and Germany and Italy? I mean, these countries have been at each other's throats in a way that India and China have never been for 1,000 years. And you can make security alliances between people who have an existential threat against one another once somebody big comes in and knocks their heads together. So that's the obvious point. But do you want to take over?
Yeah, because my stuff's pretty simple, and then you can jump back in. I actually think it is the only people this is absolutely critical to is China and Russia. So China and Russia put the combined deal together of goods, services, resources. And if you join Team Red, we'll call it Red just for the hell of it because of their flags.
It is Team Red.
Yeah. If you join Team Red, you get a guaranteed deal on everything you need to keep your regime upright, everything to buy your people off, everything to keep your economy upright, everything to keep your military able to bristle, pointing at the neighbors who haven't joined Team Red. And my feeling is that this is where, in a sense, the hardest negotiation will be for Putin and Xi, because all Xi wants is Team Red to be huge and selling stuff worldwide. Putin, of course, likes the idea of influence, and this will be the thing over time where if there's going to be a sort of battle between the two of them personally, it's where it will be. But I actually think Team Red won't actually care about the architecture being deep. They will only care that countries who want to keep their regime upright can get what they need to do so. And in the main, the first countries on board with this are going to be countries that none of us would want to live in.
So if we go then back to this notion that there's a new strategic alignment that's going to be sort of coming together, and it'll be coming together in terms of using the influence of food security, energy security, and all these highly sensitive pressure points that they're going to be operating against the West. How then do we see the West's response to this? I mean, at the moment, the West seems hamstrung in trying to figure out a decisive way of dealing with the Russians in Ukraine. There's no talk of, American forces or NATO forces entering the Ukraine battle space anytime soon. No talk about a no-fly zone at the minimum. If we can't be a bit more strident in the way that we actually go about our own business here in the West, what likelihood do we have in being able to counteract anything that comes out of Beijing and Moscow?
Well, my argument would be that we run diametrically the reverse risk. We want to not be going in. Going in is a trap into Ukraine. And with the ineptitude and incompetence of the Biden administration, that is what we as a West risk. I cannot see the West as a political and cultural project winning in the long term, as in not committing suicide, unless there is regime change in Washington. And I don't mean that in any, the
dastardly sense. Just smart people who aren't senile coming through.
Well, what do you mean, Donald Trump? Sorry,
smart people who aren't senile.
At least in the short term, mean Donald Trump. Put brutally, it isn't just Biden who is inept and incompetent and not altogether there and therefore not paying attention to his crew. It's also that he's ideologically aligned to his crew, and his crew are neocons. I mean, they are just such a...
They're living in the 1990s. They're Clinton-esque in their lack of understanding of how the world works.
They are a coagulation of neocons. That is the only way to describe them. Just so much rotten ideology.
And what about Europe? I mean, surely von der Leyen's doing a wonderful job in terms of showing some form of unity and leadership, right, Rhoderick? I mean...
yeah. Ask Europeans. I mean, such a bad German defense minister.
They
and
got
apparently,
rid of it to European level stuff. Yep.
Yeah.
She made them run around with broomsticks rather than let them have guns because she didn't trust them with guns.
Mm-hmm.
So to turn the European idea around, let's spin this the other way, that if a very, very big part of Putin's plan is to push as much of the Ukrainian population into Europe as possible so they're not his problem, this is essentially stem cell therapy for Europe. You're adding young, capable people who are willing to work on farms and work in factories back into the European population, right at a time where we're going to go into food and fuel shortages. So imagine what it's going to be like in 3 to 4 months' time when African migrants who are hungry and can't afford petrol start trying to cross the Mediterranean to hit a Europe that's now got 10 million white people moved in. Europe is going to be a very different, ugly beast at the end of this because it's now got what it always wanted, which is more competent people who want to be European, who look and think more or less the same, which is going to suit lots of old underlying ideas of what Europe is, which really haven't gone away.
Yeah, and also amongst that 10 million, there's an awful lot who are genuine, authentic Nazis. And we're not allowed to say that that's true, but it is. They're not just the Azov people, but their supporters, their families, their entire social system is going to be re-injected into the east of the European Union. I don't know how we deal with that.
Well, it's not even going to be the east. Talking to my friend in Ireland last night, hotels in Dublin are full of Ukrainians. So, and again, I'm going to just sort of go shrug at this whole idea that there's that many Nazis because I'm unconvinced by that argument. But fundamentally, what you are getting is people who can imagine a good future, will work their ass off, want to have kids. So they're going to be the only part of the European population growing, the only part willing to be on farms. If we look at it from the other side, that militarizing the eastern border of Europe, of sticking 40, 50,000 troops in Romania and spending money nonstop will be the best thing to happen to Romania in 100 years. This is economic viability for the first time in a long time. All along the eastern border, we have that same thing, that NATO troops on NATO troop pay, spending money on weekends is a massive earner for these countries and will be beneficial to everyone. So Europe and America fundamentally stop being, anything like each other as this goes on, because America can huddle down behind oceans. Europe gets an injection of motivated people, has Putin on its border, has chaos of food and oil shortages to its south. And Europe has to become muscular and nasty very quickly, or everything will go horribly wrong.
Look, I want to bring the conversation back to the main theme that we were starting off on, which is basically, China. How's China responding to all of this? And what actually does this mean for Taiwan? Now, the last time we had Rhoderick on, he did mention something rather interesting with regard to the fact that he thinks that China will make a play for Taiwan in the upcoming midterm elections because the American political process will be, in a relatively vulnerable state. Now, Rod, have you given some more thought to this proposition, and do you think this is still something that we ought to be concerned with?
So, in grand terms, the way I see it is the Chinese have gone from having decades-long timetable to having months-long timetable. Nobody can know what the hell is going to happen as long as Biden is president. Biden being president risks World War III every day. And the Chinese need to get as much as they can without pulling a trigger and hopefully getting rid of him as quickly as possible. There is talk about Chinese involvement in getting rid of Trump. I don't know if that's true or not, or whether they've got buyer's remorse. But you look at the way the man is performing, his speeches yesterday, there's real danger there. This is not a person who is in command of his office, and he's in command of nuclear strike weapons. Chinese want Taiwan. They're going to have to go for it as quickly as they can while he stays in power. And it seems to me the obvious thing is get it right at that election moment. But the Chinese are not renowned for their being brave in foreign policy moves.
I was just about to say something on that. Yep.
So they might play their usual game, and they might think, we can do that in 100 years' time.
See, I think you've touched on a very interesting point there, Rhoderick, and that is that the Chinese have always played a very cautious hand. But I think also another thing that needs to be brought into the equation here is China hasn't fought a major war since 1979 against Vietnam, which it lost. Now, I don't know whether or not you could then draw the bow and say, well, the Chinese military of today is a far more different, far more competent beast.
No, it's
not. I mean, what one would say
it's
that
technically capable and personnel-wise still incompetent.
Well, if that's then the case, any kind of struggle for Taiwan would probably see a humiliating backdown of the Chinese military, because they
Because
have
they've
to
got
still.
numbers.
Yeah, but numbers mean nothing. I mean, numbers can block the sea lanes. It can do stuff, but it can't do the kinetics very well. Because really, again, if you make the argument that the Russians want to capture as much of Ukraine intact as possible rather than wreck the joint completely, then the same mentality will have to apply for Taiwan as well. It's not a matter of eking out your vengeance on a population that's resisted you for the last 50 years. It's about capturing certain key industries that the Chinese can then roll into their own. If they break those industries, they inherit a broken state, effectively, a resentful population, certainly, and the amount of money and effort that they would have to go through to pacify the Taiwanese people after they had launched their invasion, assuming, of course, that they actually keep hold of the island, is going to be quite, well, I think that'd be a very good, expensive exercise, don't you think?
See, I'm going to disagree with you.
Yeah, okay.
The Russians want Ukrainian cities, and they want the ethnically Russian Ukrainian population. The Chinese just want the dirt. The Chinese just want an end of the dishonor that the existence of Taiwan as an independent state is. Chinese don't care how many Taiwanese people are alive at the end of the day. They don't care whether they stay in Taiwan or not. If they stay, they'll get Uyghur'd. I don't think the Chinese have any reason to fight in anything like the careful and methodical way that the Russians are fighting. They just want the dirt.
Gee, that's an interesting thing to say, that the Russians are fighting in a very careful way. One would say, from the images that we've received so far of places like Mariupol or, for instance, Kharkiv, that there's been a lot of damage to the urban infrastructure. So you're suggesting that what we're seeing is really not what we're seeing here?
I cannot tell, nor do I think can any of us who are not on the ground, how much of the damage is done by the Ukrainians and how much of the damage is done by the Russians. We also can't tell how much of the damage is infrastructure as opposed to population centers. Because it seems to me, certainly from what I read and what I see about the Russian combat, is they are avoiding population centers as much as possible. You can rebuild docks. In fact, there's a lot of money to be made in rebuilding docks, but you can't rebuild people, and they want to keep the people.
No, see, that's where I disagree with you. Other than the people in eastern Ukraine who want to be Russian, I don't think they want to keep anybody, which is why blowing some cities to pieces is the best way to make the point. Leave now so you're not my problem.
Yeah, but I think they will target the ethnically Ukrainian cities when they do that.
Yeah. Really, this is only about getting the land in both cases. I agree with Rod that the whole idea that China want the advanced industry of Taiwan, no, they've been happily stealing information from everyone they can for the last 40 years. If they haven't stolen everything they need yet, what are they really going to gain from taking industry in Taiwan? The reality is China makes things by using Japanese and German equipment. The Taiwanese, make more of their own to make things, but that's still not something they, are going to fix readily. The other side of this is Chinese order books are already starting to empty out. People assume people aren't going to be able to afford stuff later this year, and Chinese factories are already starting to slow. I really can't conceive of Xi pushing for an invasion when his factories are slowing at the same time that the railway line from Russia to China is moving as much stuff as it can. The one oil line running into China is the most difficult to manage without advanced Western companies running the fields and the pipelines. So oil supply is not guaranteed to China. Food supply can't move any faster, and factory orders are going down. I really can't see that Xi, on top of that, is going to risk everything on trying to get Taiwan now when he can wait a year and see how much Team Red have grown into controlling more than half the world.
There's another issue here which hasn't been mentioned, but that's the issue of capital flight. I mean, really, China, unlike Japan, did not come to modernity based on its own industry. It came to modernity on the basis of Western investment and Western industry. At what point is Chinese caution cognizant of the fact that they don't want to frighten the crap out of Western industrialists who are still in country, keeping factories going. Because if there is capital flight of Western capital out of China, that may signal the end of the Chinese economy as we understand it. I mean, at the moment, we've been talking about China as it's this incredibly self-sufficient, autarkic
No, none of us have said that.
beast. Well,
it's not self-sufficient in any way, shape, or form. This is why it needs the deals with half the world within the next 3 months, because it needs to replace that capital flow, and it needs to guarantee resource flow, and it needs to make sure that trade will be going two-way again as fast as humanly possible, to balance up the fact that with another 10 million people, to work in Europe and to be European consumers, why does Europe need to care about China anymore? So it's in a hurry to establish this new world of being able to trade with people that need it desperately, the way it needs capital desperately.
Yeah, and what about that whole Peter Zion argument that China is going to be one of the net losers in the not too distant future because its geography dictates that it can never really be a peer competitor of something like the United States?
It's really more of a demographic problem. They're the oldest population on Earth. They're older than the Japanese.
Their problem is not really America, it's India. The great demographic issues of the next 30, 40 years is going to be an extra 3 billion Africans. And then I don't mean, lots of young Africans. I mean, Africa going from being a high mortality young population to a longer aged middle income population. That's the most dramatic population change in the world. But then the next one is going to be the extra billion Asians who aren't going to be Chinese, who aren't going to be Japanese, who aren't going to be Vietnamese. There's not an awful lot left. I mean, really, we're talking about India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and India will have the lion's share of that. So India will overtake China. And the Indian population is, from my time in India, it's just phenomenal how industrious everybody has to be just to stay alive.
Yeah, and Australia, of course, is very concerned with what's going on with China, especially in terms of how China runs influence operations here in Australia, as well as with regard to whether or not we are going to get involved in a stoush with China over Taiwan and the South China Seas. How do you guys actually think that that is actually playing a major role in the way that we develop ourselves here in Australia? Rod?
Again, everything comes down to the Americans. If the Americans push for a shooting war, then you're in the thick of it. And I don't see you being ready for it. I don't think the Chinese in themselves are in the steering position for how this relationship goes. If you're lucky, the Chinese will play for time and you'll have another decade to get ready. If they jump off the cliff, if they think they have no choice but to jump off a cliff and go and do something like Taiwan, then everything's up for grabs. And I don't believe for a heartbeat, you're a huge country, but you're a tiny population. I do not believe you're going to be able to stand up on your own. And who knows what's going to happen with the Americans.
Mm-hmm. David?
Fundamentally, we've got the thing this week of, the Solomon Islands parliamentarians pointing out again how hard China are pushing for a security deal where they get to permanently base troops in the Solomon Islands. And once again, we're asleep at the wheel. So I think what I'd say with Australia is whatever happens to us, we deserve for incompetence.
Yeah. But isn't that your when it's bad, it's good problem?
Yeah, nothing changes. Because life here is good even when it's bad, there's no reason to change incompetence. And, in real terms, all the pushes to get control of PNG and Solomon Islands will be before we start getting delivery of American ships regularly and have become an extension of the US military.
So much for sovereignty in the Australian situation then, yeah?
Well, again, it's a nice idea that we wrote a lot about and talked to a lot of people about.
Mm-hmm.
And you still have Senator Rex Patrick coming out and not being able to say the simple phrase sovereign capability as an ex-naval officer, someone who understands it. So when the one person that implicitly understands what we're talking about has served on a Collins, spent time on American boats, when he can't say sovereign capability and run around screaming it, who's listening?
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. But then I always remember that conversation that we had with Jim Molan with regard to, the development of sovereign capability. And it's funny, you can say a lot about certain people, but when you sit with them, you understand where their political animus comes from. And, at that time that we were sitting down talking with Molan, I could tell that we weren't talking to a former military general anymore. We were talking to a present day politician. And I think that once you actually make that transition, it's almost like a Faustian deal. Whatever real thought that you may have had once about where Australia should be situated in the scheme of things, you then think, well, look, I can't bite the hand that feeds me on all these really deeply sensitive policy issues, so I may as well just go with the flow. I kind of got that sense.
Well, I think he'd got the reality of serving in the places he'd served and seeing what the Americans could bring to the table. And that is, we are either in the American slipstream or we're alone. And once you've reached that fundamental conclusion, then there's all sorts of other problems. And again, this is where China will be busy. I don't think anything will happen with Taiwan. That is a waste of resources at the moment for too great a danger with too many other problems. But for what tiny amount of resources it will take to take the Solomon Islands off the chessboard and put it in their camp, to take PNG off the board, put it in their camp, and to continue to do this so that in a year's time, the combined deal to the Pacific of fuel, food, where your kids get educated, who builds your phone system, who builds your dock, in a world that is going to be much harder if the 3 million Russian barrels are offline in 2 months' time and are offline for years. Team Red have got bigger wins to get, than to worry about things like Taiwan at the moment.
You don't think that the policymakers in Canberra must be rather concerned, shall I say, about the moves that the Chinese have made, particularly with regard to the Solomon Islands, and some policy-making excellence is going to come out of the corridors of power there, and we're going to check the Chinese as they move into the oceanic area? Or do you think, that's just simply beyond us, because we take that sort of lapsadaisical attitude with regard to defense and sovereign conditions, and, in the end, it's all too hard. We'll give it to the Americans, and, we'll do a little bit around the edges, but we won't do too much to rattle the big powers around us.
What was it, 2019 APEC in New Guinea, where out of the blue, suddenly Australia, PNG and America are going to develop a major base in the Manus Lagoon.
Yep.
And the CCP packed up their bat and ball and went home early, so there wasn't a communique at the end. They had that big a tantrum because they'd just undone 3 years of work of taking control of the PNG military and police force. And what have we done with Manus Lagoon since?
Yep.
So 3 years ago, we had a shot to be in the game and to be converting that into US Marine Corps, probably Australian Naval and SOCOM base, and training the PNG military and police force on their own ground, but in our bit of turf, and to then roll the same deal out to the Solomon Islands and to start rolling it out across the area. Come and train with us on Manus Island. Come and train with your friends and neighbours. 3 years later.
Why did it fall apart?
Because no one got off their arse.
I think
was
that there was
or was it the Americans is the question.
We were meant to take lead was the sense I got.
Yeah. There's also this thing, we've got a bit of a split in terms of competency here in Australia between the Department of Defence and DFAT. And I think that in DFAT, I hate to say it, but they are run by and large by a bunch of tree-hugging hippies. On the one side, they're idealists. They want to achieve all ends in a non-military fashion, and they don't like the idea of defence taking the lead in much of anything. And I think that these sort of internecine squabbles within Canberra have had something to do with the fact that we can't move decisively ahead of the game. And when the Chinese move, they move as one. They're like the Borg, right? So, they've got a single-minded construct. Resistance is futile. We've got lots and lots of brown paper bags of money to corrupt local officials with, and we're just going to go in. Whereas here in Australia, we'll sit down, we'll cogitate and agonize over certain situations. Then we say that we can't do this because that's corrupt practice. The Chinese can have that. It's not really that important to us. And then we kind of pat ourselves on the back and say, well, job well done. You know, we're ideologically pure as opposed to being strategically sound. Something like that.
And it's even worse than that. You know, go find DFAT's press release on what's going on in the Solomons. It took 11 lawyers, 27 diplomats, and someone sacrificing a goat to generate something so meaningless. It's utterly meaningless. Yeah. And that was their big comment about our neighbor, who we have a long-term relationship with. Yeah, and listeners, never forget, we went into the Solomon Islands earlier in this century because the Chinese had created so much havoc that the locals wanted to kill the Chinese population in the Solomons. And at that point, the PLA were too incompetent to get their own people out. And we were sufficiently tree hugger that we went and helped them get their people out.
Yep.
And we essentially let it get to the same level of disaster again and lost all the gains of establishing a good working relationship between AFP, Australian Defence Force, and institutions in the Solomon Islands. So as usual, we go do something and then we get distracted by cricket and football.
Oh. So, okay, having said that, you know, we have launched into a new trilateral, mini-lateral, if you will, called AUKUS. Now, apparently that is meant to be the thing that will save our bacon in the end because it stars two of our favorite people. We've got the Brits on the one side and we've got the Yanks on the other. And, you know, the Americans are the elephant in the room. They bring the most to the table and we feel the most comfortable with basically cozying up to the superpower and staying underneath the superpower's umbrella. Now, in terms of the mechanics that AUKUS puts forward, you know, building nuclear-powered submarines, developing sort of trilateral relationships in terms of sharing quantum computing and space technologies and various other cyber defenses and all this kind of thing, you don't think that that's going to probably be the security architecture of choice within the Indo-Pacific where, you know, these three powers just get together and basically hold firm just like NATO does in Europe?
Too little, too late.
Yeah, it might, if you could rope the French in, but
because they've got the confidence in the area.
I think you haven't got the time to do it if the Chinese are really going to make a push.
All the low-hanging fruit will be gone by the time anything from AUKUS is relevant. And it's the UK that's desperate to be back in the game. So really, we should be pushing to do anything with the UK now. Yep. Basing half the British Navy here if they want and doing massive forward supply and having their crews just do FIFO. So we got more kit handy.
Yep.
The general impression I'm under is that our ambition is to have mixed crews on our ships heading out to you and have tons of stuff out there. But all of this has been put seriously under question by what is happening in Europe because none of that was on the table when all these grand ideas were decided by Whitehall and by, let's be frank, by Boris Johnson himself. It is an ego trip, but it's also, to a lesser degree, an obvious strategic ambition, is to get past the East of Suez problem, that we've over-restricted ourselves as a naval actor. But we're not prepared to spend the money on the ships.
Yeah, that's right.
We'd much rather have the best ships in the world and have three of them than have enough ships to go everywhere.
Yeah, that is a problem. And I think that there's also another problem here, and that is that no Western country, actually very few countries generally speaking, doesn't matter what the color of their politics is, they're not very good at walking and chewing gum at the same time. So at the moment, everyone's fixated in Ukraine. And we really have a hard time here in Australia to see our local region. I mean, at the moment, you know, David quite correctly raised the issue that we're facing with the Chinese on the Solomon Islands. But, you know, it's not getting sufficient airtime in the local media because the media is now just totally brought into this whole Ukraine crisis, which is a crisis far, far removed from Australia's shores. And I mean, David and I have always said, why don't we pay more attention to what's going on in our own neighborhood? We'll be of more use to ourselves and the people in our neighborhood. But rather than that, we keep on looking at at all these distant conflicts, which we get eventually dragged into for one reason or another, leaving ourselves exposed here because we can't operate on, well, look, there's a crisis here, there's a crisis there. Let's put a little bit of attention to, say, Ukraine, but let's put a lot of attention on the Solomon Islands. We just can't do that. It's not in our policymaking genetics here in Australia.
And the other side of this, listeners, the day we're recording this is the day the Australian federal budget will come out. And the one thing I will guarantee that won't be in the budget will be government backing to build an LNG to nitrogen fertilizer plant somewhere in Australia to guarantee that Australia continues to be the food bowl that the world needs.
Yeah, no.
And yet, if we did a single thing today as a country, that's the game changer that positions us to be more relevant to our region, more relevant to help more people, more relevant to build and buy influence, and we won't do it.
Well, this end, last year, there was a series of policy decisions around food production, which basically signaled that we were going to go back to a sort of 1970s arrangement, which is basically we would feed ourselves via buying everything from you.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't sort it out, we're going to starve.
Well, that's okay. You can send us oil and fertilizer, and then we'll grow it for you. Okay, Rod?
Yeah, I don't see Britain producing any fertilizer. I mean, we produce enough that could be used for fertilizer.
Yeah.
We don't.
Out of number 10, you mean?
Yes.
Yes.
So fundamentally, here's our problem about the West, and that is that AUKUS was meant to be the new shiny toy. We still have no idea what it can deliver, and on anything that is necessary now with the new reality of food insecurity, fuel insecurity, fertilizer insecurity, AUKUS has got nothing to offer. Whereas in the meantime, the only operations the Chinese can safely get on with are grabbing all the low-hanging fruit around the South Pacific before, Team Red offers its deal of the century. And it won't be long before the deal of the century is on the table, and we'll be spluttering over in the corner going, well, we actually need that fertilizer and fuel too. And guess what? We're in the camp with the Americans who are now energy self-sufficient, thanks to shale oil. We're going to have to be dealing with the fact that the Middle East, the current estimates are that food prices are going to go up 6 times before Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
Now, going up 3 times caused the Arab Spring. Try 6 times.
Yeah. Everything that we're looking at the moment have global repercussions. So it doesn't matter whether or not we're looking at the Ukraine or we're looking at issues closer to Australia, but every step we're looking at things that will show that the world is deeply, deeply in crisis. And arguably, and I mean, this is obviously a political point, but until we get our politics sorted out in our respective countries, we don't really stand much of a chance of actually surviving this well. I mean, even the lucky country syndrome of Australia, for instance, we can be lazy and lucky, but when push comes to shove and we get confronted by a certain set of circumstances and we still have no answer because, it's all too hard, we'll farm it out to the Americans or the Brits or someone's going to bloody help us. That's not going to bode well for Australia, I think, in the not too distant future.
No.
Steps further. No, you go there.
Well, I was just going to say, and just to come back to sort of Taiwan, Taiwan is something that we're thinking about because it's pre-February thinking. We're thinking about Taiwan because Taiwan was on the table. We've been habituated to think about Taiwan. And I think the biggest thing we could say about China since the invasion of Ukraine is, I'd assume like the Americans, they've got multiple buildings full of lots of people doing plans for absolutely everything. And 90% of that building have scrapped everything they were working on, and the 10% of weirdos who were working on the crazy options. And that is that fundamentally overnight, the world gets dropped on its head. And we have to be in a deal with the Russians to keep our economy upright. And we have to probably get along with the Indians and Pakistanis for the long term because we need a guaranteed market. And Western capital will be gone. And South America and Africa won't be able to afford Chinese goods because they will have no discretionary spending money once they've bought food and fuel. Who would have thought that the 10% of weirdo planners in the bottom of the basement in Beijing are now probably the ones having to chart the future of 1.4 billion people?
That's interesting.
I was going to say, it doesn't matter if Canberra or London or Brussels or Berlin sort out their problems, as long as America is fucked. Whatever we do to fix ourselves, America is just too big a problem in our ecosystem. And I'm completely convinced that the Biden administration stripped Western Europe of its independence. The way Britain has behaved in the last couple of weeks as a crazy war cheerleader is just completely out of nature for the kind of policy decisions we should have made. And the Germans, okay, granted it was a new government that didn't really know what they were doing, but they talked themselves into the destruction of their economy. There's no German leader that would have done that before. Until we deal with something to do with the Americans, and we either need to loosen the chains or they need to have regime change.
To sort of explain, I think, what Rhoderick's getting at here, listeners, what we're really seeing is a massive level of cognitive dissonance. We're seeing too many political elites that have been drinking the Kool-Aid they made for themselves for 40 to 50 years on the success of neoliberalism, neoconservatism, delusional economic policy. And the world has just simply stopped being as it's meant to be. And, until the cognitive dissonance ends, there's no chance of better policy. And there's still no sign of the cognitive dissonance ending. Because as Rhoderick is saying, Boris Johnson is in some sort of delusional state. Macron still thinks talking to Putin matters. Biden is allowed to make gaffes and they can't get his meds right. We're worried about an election and we're still putting money in Australia into car parks and Liberal-held seats. Like, have we learnt nothing from the last month? The Solomon Islands is about to have armed Chinese police patrolling whenever they feel like it. PNG has gone from being back in our camp in 2019 back to, I'd assume by the end of this year, the Chinese plan to retrain, rearm and give new communications gear to the PNG military and police force will be back on the table. Cognitive dissonance is a real thing, and it's a big thing that's affecting what we're seeing at the moment. And whatever country can get past cognitive dissonance fastest has a great advantage because they start making reasonable decisions.
Well, isn't cognitive dissonance all about the fact that, the problems that we're facing are just too goddamn scary? And,
No,
it's
about you do, and you justify what you did because you've always done it and it made your life nice. On top of that, the problems are getting bigger, but whichever country can wake up first has a huge advantage. And again, to go back to something that Rod said earlier, let's look at what countries have got lots of young people. Young people in the main have a lower problem with cognitive dissonance because so much in their life is new. So who is going to be most adaptable in the world we're describing? It's going to be the Africans and the Indians, and then probably the Pakistanis, the Sri Lankans and parts of Latin America. But they are not the ones making decisions at the moment.
I haven't heard anything about Southeast Asia. Again, it's a stomping ground that the Chinese want to influence. But if we're looking at, a country like the Philippines, for instance, highly young, very bright population, surely...
No resources on islands with all the problems that go with being an archipelago. Again, why the old Filipino problem would change of just simply you have to deal with everything being difficult because of so many islands, everything being difficult because of such extreme weather, such a corrupt system with almost no institutions that deliver good outcomes. The fact that the Filipinos are so remarkable is probably the only reason the place isn't worse.
I mean, its utility to the Chinese is where it is.
Yeah,
as
it's not
opposed
what
to
it is.
anything about it.
Yeah.
And for them, that means owning an island or two. It doesn't mean infiltrating the entire society.
Yep, and selling stuff to a population that can't afford to buy anyone else's stuff. So they're one of the emergency populations for Team Red. Like the deal to the Philippines will be outstanding.
So if
the countries that would be interesting would be Indonesia.
I was just going to say Indonesia, to me, seems like the interesting pivot point here because, being a fundamentally Islamic population, not necessarily traditional Islamic population as we'd understand it from examples in the Middle East, but certainly a sort of very unique form. it would be interesting to see how they deal with China, considering their own patchy history with domestic Chinese populations. What's your thoughts?
I would desperately hope for once we get it right with Indonesia, because if you look at the amount of capital flight from China to Indonesia in the last 2 years, and all the new factories making things that used to be made in China better, Indonesia is, for the first time ever in a lot of ways, better connected to the rest of the world in a way where the world doesn't know it cares about Indonesia. And I would desperately hope it can hold that up and sustain that.
The great risk for Australia is that Indonesia does get really successful, really prosperous, produces all tons of stuff, and your relationship is terrible.
Well, we should essentially just make part of the reason of building that nitrogen plant to essentially become a permanent food supplier. At low cost.
That makes
non-negotiable. Once again, the nitrogen plant should have been in today's budget.
Well, what will be in the budget is obviously military related, considering the fact that this is an election year and Prime Minister Scott Morrison wants to buy the so-called security vote. So we're looking at, extending base capabilities for the Americans and British out in Western Australia and in Queensland. So I suppose that's one way of looking at things. But, as you rightly point out, David, I mean, the idea of actually having sovereign capability in terms of getting the fertilizer production capacities here in Australia, one of the things that always goes against us is the fact that, yes, we're a major agricultural power in our own right. But unlike the North American continent, where it's much more predictable temperate, here it's not so predictable and not so temperate. I mean, we are the land of floods and droughts, as the east coast of Australia is currently experiencing historic levels of flooding at the moment. But then once that flips around to an El Nino weather pattern, we're going to be back into a drought cycle. So, of course, we have to always forward project between these extremes. I mean, in other parts of the world, like Ukraine or maybe parts of Russia, but certainly the North American continent, they can grow whatever they like, pretty much whenever they like. There's not that sort of huge fluctuation.
They also have their own
variation.
fertilizer production, which again, with 8 billion people on this ball, the ball is running out of the ability to generate food without chemical help.
Yep, correct.
So it doesn't matter where. The Americans gave up exporting fertilizer years ago. The Chinese gave up exporting years ago. Belarus and Russia only did it because, they can do it cheaply and it was a way to earn money. But even they are going to keep everything they need to maintain their status as bread bowls. It's just a question of who they're going to sell to. Yeah.
Well, anyway, gentlemen, I think that pretty much wraps things up. So my thanks to our special guest, Rhoderick Miller, for being on Strategicon. My thanks to co-host David Olney and to producer Michael Migali for their contributions. And to our audience, thanks for listening. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to the audio version of Strategicon through the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. And please like us on the Sage International Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. You can also watch our podcasts on video through the Strategicon Raw YouTube channel when they're available, easily accessed by clicking on the link provided on our website. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and of course on the Sage International site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, it's goodbye from me, John Bruni.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.